Hello, I'm Jim Claypool, and welcome to this edition of Northern Lights. Northern Lights, you recall, is the program that focuses upon the accomplishments of people associated with Northern Kentucky University. It could be students, faculty, staff, members of the Board of Regents, administration, or people from the community. And my very special guest and my colleague in the Department of History and Geography for many years here at Northern Kentucky University is Dr. Eric Jackson. Eric, welcome to the program.
Thanks for inviting me.
Eric, I want to say, first of all, how much I appreciate you being here today, but I want to explore something about your past here. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Gary, Indiana, hometown, as famously or infamously of the Jackson family and
right.
Other folks like that.
You didn't know the Jacksons?
No, but of course.
Yeah. Well, it's famous for something else too. You know, the Music Man, Gary, Indiana, Gary, Indiana.
Oh yeah,
Gary, Indiana.
Yeah. Interesting story. I never heard that song until I left Gary as a teenager, but I kind of embrace it now.
What's Gary like?
Presently, Gary's pretty slow moving because of the steel mill industry. U.S. Steel around the late 70s, early 80s, the steel industry took a major hit and numerous layoffs occurred. So the town itself is more or less a dying town.
So you're a transplanted Hoosier?
I'm a transplanted Hoosier.
Well, so am I. I was born in Evansville, Indiana, and my family got into Indiana in the early 1820s, and we, in fact, still have the family land up near Lafayette.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm a Hoosier as well, but ended up in Kentucky, just as you have as well. And what about your mother and father? What sort of work did they do?
My dad worked in a U.S. Steel mill for 45 years, and my mom was a nurse at a local high school there. Yeah, so one of the issues that drove me from Gary is I didn't want to work in the steel mill.
Yeah, was a union, of course?
Oh, of course, a union man.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? I see, too, that you belong to the Indiana Historical Society. Is that something that's kind of a carryover from your past?
Oh, sure. I developed interest in Indiana history when I graduated, or actually going to school at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and also worked at the Indiana General Assembly as a page for a couple state representatives and a couple senators, and went back there as a tour guide and did some research there in Indianapolis, and just decided to join the Indiana Historical Society.
Well, Indianapolis is very dear to my heart. My great-great-uncle was the man who had the Claypool Hotel there, and they now have a shopping court there called the Claypool Court. And one time he owned half of downtown Indianapolis, and then, like so many others, left it to his children, and they lost it all, as you well know. And then I had a great-great-grandfather who was at one time the youngest legislator in the state of Indiana, retired, went back to the farm, and then came back and was the oldest legislator, and his picture's prominent there in the Capitol. I've done some work with the Indiana Historical Society, and they wanted his picture, and they did an article on him and so on. So I have a real fondness for Indiana, and our ties are numerous there. And you went to Ball State.
Ball State Cardinals, yes. Back in the 80s, majored in United States history, minored in political science and African American studies.
Was there a particular professor there that had a great influence on you?
Not one, numerous one. A professor in African American studies who's no longer there. I think he moved to the University of Iowa, Hal Chase. Also, a couple faculty members who are now at Miami University. Andrew Caton, who does a lot of material research on Indiana. So those two gentlemen were my major influence.
Really, you got kind of on the cutting edge of a developing field. The interest in American and Afro-American studies was really picking up a great deal of steam. They're tied, of course, obviously into the Civil Rights Movement and all the legislation associated with that, but we began to look at things in a different perspective at that time.
No question. During the 80s, actually I remember being involved in civil rights activities back in Gary. Gary is known for having one of the first African-American mayors of a major city, Mayor Richard Hatcher in '72. So that's when I connected myself with studying African-American history, and also my interest in history in general. As I tell the story numerous times, I can't remember not reading historical autobiographies or biographies. I remember reading as early as 6 or 7 years old a piece on Thurgood Marshall and Dr. King and those folks, and that kind of piqued my interest and continued, obviously, when I went to college in Ball State.
I had a flash of that when I was at Murray. We had a fellow come and visit us, Julian Bond. I don't know if you remember Julian Bond.
Yes, yes.
And he was kind of in his prime right at that particular time. He's since not played as prominent a role as he was at that time, but he was very articulate, very gregarious, and a really dynamic personality.
Oh, no question. I think I met him back in the 80s in Chicago. I also used to go to Chicago just to enjoy life. And then he was at some function, and that's the first time I met him. But pretty dynamic person. Involved civil rights movement, knew Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and Reverend Shuttlesworth, who lived just across the river in Cincinnati for numerous years. Actually, he still lives there. He's in his 80s now.
Mm-hmm. So you pretty early on decided that this was going to be your field. You were going to be a historian. You're going to focus upon Afro-American studies or some corollary studies in that area. And then you moved on to the University of Cincinnati. What drew you to the University of Cincinnati?
From a pragmatic standpoint, just the region itself being connected with the Underground Railroad and those type of issues and civil rights issues in this part of the country. From a financial standpoint, it was just an issue of applying and receiving scholarship monies.
Mm-hmm. You took a master's at UC and
Yes.
then also your doctorate in education and history at University of Cincinnati.
Yes.
And what did you write? Did you write a dissertation?
Yes, my dissertation was on the integration of Indianapolis public schools, which is a curious story because Indianapolis, on the one hand, was pretty conservative when it came to integration. For example, during the 1920s, it had a huge Klan membership in that area, but Indianapolis at the same time, they integrated their schools, or at least started the process prior to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So it was an odd situation. On the one hand, you had Klan activity there, but at the same token, you had integration occurring in their public school system prior to Brown versus Board of Education. So that drew me there, that uniqueness.
Yeah, I think his name was Stevenson or something like that. He was the leader of the Klan. Of course, he fell on hard times because he got involved with taking a girl across state lines. He got prosecuted for it, and a great scandal there. And it's interesting you mentioned that because several years ago, I had an apartment I was renting out, a duplex, and had a gentleman came here and was working in our food services at the university who had lived in Indianapolis. And he had experienced things in Indianapolis that he hadn't experienced elsewhere in the country. They were very liberal toward the issue of integration and the race relationships and so on. And he encountered some things in other areas that he just really couldn't deal with, whereas Indianapolis had been a wonderful situation for him, which is something you found to be true as well.
Oh, no question. I mean, it's a fabulous town. It's a street called Indiana Avenue where most African Americans, their houses, their communities, their business were on these few blocks. But at the same time, you had powerful African Americans developing in political offices and also sports figures, people such as Oscar Robertson, who eventually came to the University of Cincinnati to play basketball. He went to Crispus Attucks that was created in Indianapolis in 1922. So that was a powerful high school in Indianapolis for the African American community.
I remember it quite well, what a team that Chris Attucks team had. And of course, I saw Oscar play in college for 2 years there. I don't know how I snuck in, but I got to see him. And he was a man playing with boys. He was just light years ahead of all of them. And have you had an opportunity to talk with Oscar?
I've talked to Oscar one time. I saw him walking down the streets of Cincinnati. Most pleasant guy I've ever run into, who has that much prestige. On the one hand, you can understand his history and what he went through as an African American growing up in certain time periods in Indianapolis and also in Cincinnati. But he doesn't have any animosity. I mean, he just shook my hand and said, "Glad to see you. What are you working on?" It's just a pleasant, just regular guy.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, too. I saw him out at Turfway Racecourse this year. They did a special promotion. They put out a bottle of Maker's Mark, and they had the big O on it, and he was there to sign bottles along with Bill Samuels from Maker's Mark. But the interesting thing was his brother was with him, and his brother was an extremely accomplished athlete on his own right, a baseball and a football player as well, not as good in basketball as Oscar. And it was interesting to stand with his brother and get the commentary of what was going on and the things about his brother. And both of them have been inducted into the Chris Attucks Hall of Fame. So we overlook the fact that it's a broad-based thing. It isn't just that one person who kind of symbolizes it all, you know.
No question.
And then you started teaching. You've done a little teaching at Union Institute, but you got involved. How did you get to Northern?
A colleague of mine, there was a friend of mine in grad school at the University of Cincinnati, James Westheider, who now teaches at the University of Cincinnati. He suggested I come over here and teach a few classes while I was working on my dissertation at the University of Cincinnati. And from that point on, which was, I think, 1992, maybe, 93, that's when my career started here at NKU.
So you've evolved. You started out as an instructor, and you moved up to assistant, and now you're an associate professor.
Yes.
On your way upward and onward.
Going somewhere.
Going somewhere. Yeah, we always going somewhere in academia, that's for sure.
No question.
And initially, what were some of the courses you taught here?
I taught Introduction to African American Studies. I remember when that course was introduced as a major general studies course for first and second year students, actually for anybody, but initially for first and second year students. So I taught numerous sections of that, African American history, survey level African American history, and then I broadened out to colonial America. One of my favorite courses these days is team teaching with our Latin American specialist in the history department, Robert Wilcox. We team teach a course on race in the Americas where we compare the construction of race in the United States with Latin America. It's a 2-semester course.
Well, what's the fundamental, just if you had to put it in a sentence or two, what's the parallel there?
The parallel is in the United States, race is generally, at least up until the past 15, 20 years, has been looked at as literally a black and white issue. In Latin America, it's more complex because of the different ethnic and racial groups that was in Latin America from its early origins.
I experienced that once. I met a gentleman who had lived in Mexico, and I was trying to disparage him in any way. I said, of course, you're a Mexican. He said, oh, no, I'm not a Mexican. And I said, well, what are you then? He said, I'm a Spaniard. Mm-hmm. He said, my family settled here as Spaniards. My racial composition is Spaniards. We were grandees. And he took great offense to me calling him a Mexican, which I meant nothing wrong about it. And that's always been a problem for me too. There was a time when I was growing up, a little bit before you, unfortunately, where we didn't use the term African American. We used black, black or white or whatever it is, and we've evolved somewhat into this. Is that does everybody on board with the African American rather than black, or is that kind of still a split thing?
It's still a split thing. It depends on who you're talking to, what community, what geographical regions, and obviously what generation you're talking to. Older African Americans call themselves black. I mean, I remember a quote from Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman refers to himself, the actor who was a major role in films like Glory and so forth, will not call himself an African American. He calls himself black. Yeah. And will not let anybody call him an African American.
Well, I'll come back and explore this a little bit more, Eric. We need to take a brief break here, but there's several other things I want to look into as well. Be sure to stay with us. We need to take a brief break here. This program is Northern Lights, and we'll be right back. That's quick. Well, welcome back to the program. The program, of course, is Northern Lights, and I'm Jim Claypool. My special guest is my colleague from the Department of History and Geography, Dr. Eric Jackson. And Eric, we were talking earlier about the fact that you were born in Indiana, grew up there, and had worked some at the Indiana Historical Society, and then later migrated to Ball State University, took your degree there, and then, of course, came to the University of Cincinnati, and came eventually to teach part-time on the first basis at Northern, and then you've evolved into a full-time teacher here.
Right.
And the areas that you have focused in is the early American history.
Yes, Colonial America.
Colonial America.
But also I've done some issues on some pieces on 20th century and civil rights, and
Yeah.
I'm all over the place.
Right. Well, I saw that. You know, you came here and you were teaching Afro-American studies, a certain segment of it, and then you broadened it out and expanded it and amplified it and hooked it in with other courses. I mean, this looks like this evolving amoeba of some sort or another.
It is.
Yeah, which that's got to be exciting.
Oh, it's exciting. I get to pick and choose different topics that I want to focus on and turn down others that become too hectic. For example, I've done some pieces on the Underground Railroad in the area, put together a piece on African American leaders in the peace movement in a certain period of time. Now I'm working on this piece on African American churches in northern Kentucky, which is exciting because it's just fertile territory that's almost nobody's touched. So I just kind of pick and choose my spots.
And you also have done something on art, dealing with black artists or Afro-American artists?
Yeah, I've done some pieces on art and how art could be used to deal with racial healings and how you interpret art. I'm not an artist, but I thought that would be a fascinating topic.
Yeah, so, well, you're just looking for ideas and thoughts and things that tie in. Your students, how do they react? You know, a lot of students probably have not been exposed in the depth that they get at a university level of the Afro-American experience. How do they react as they evolve through your classes?
Well, initially, when I started, it was a little hectic, tough, complex. I mean, because students would have these preconceived notions of what they were taught in high school or earlier. But as the years continued, I mean, it's just not an issue. I mean, they're there to learn, and I'm there to help them learn, and we're there to learn together, and it's generally not a problem, particularly when most of my classes have to do with race issues of race, construct of race, how it develops over time, the history of race to African Americans, and they just kind of know that's what's going to go on once they walk into class.
Right.
So it's generally not a problem anymore.
Good. I read a very interesting article. You may have seen it. It was in the Kentucky Humanities Council magazine this month about the free towns that developed down in Fayette County. Did you see that article?
I saw those articles.
Oh, that is really interesting material, because basically what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation, a large number of these African Americans who lived in Fayette County had already been working on the farms, on the horse farms. Many of them had been horse trainers and riding horses and such as that, and many of them had worked in the fields. And it was not to their advantage to leave Kentucky, but rather to stay there, and they now had the wherewithal, some of them, to purchase property and to create these communities, and they created some 30 or so communities right there in Fayette County with various names like New Zion and such as that, and where essentially they had a stake in the community and their society and the development. It's really a fascinating story.
It is. It's excellent story, and it needs further research. I mean, that's one of the only pieces that I've read about that particular subject matter. And obviously a book needs to be done at some point.
Oh, definitely. I don't think there's any question about that. I actually ran into that once. I used to assign an assignment in my Kentucky history class, and the assignment was two students would have to go out to a community that neither have grown up in and find out what made that community tick. Well, it turned out that two of the students actually went down into Fayette County to one of these communities and described what had happened there and so on. So I had had a glimmer of this, but I hadn't put it together in the total context that there were 30 of them. You know, there was one, but 30 is... and of course what happened, obviously, was so many of the people who had been in the horse industry became jockeys and trainers. The first three trainers of the Kentucky Derby winners in 1875, 76, and 77 were black.
Wow.
They say 13. There's some dispute, but there's at least 12 and probably 13 of the original 15 jockeys in the first Kentucky Derby were black. of the first 28 Kentucky Derbies, 15 were won by black jockeys. So you see what evolved out of this horse culture, which is what Kentucky's all about anyway, and especially in that particular region. Just in the inner circle of Fayette County today, there are 250 horse farms, so we see that. And I wonder if there isn't other stories about this state, maybe in coal mining communities and other things where these types of towns might have grown up.
Well, I'm not sure about that particular area. I know because some of my research is about the community I live in now in Florence, Boone County, that in the 1860s, 1870s, there were anywhere between 400 and 500 African American families that owned property and farms in that area. And they had a stake into the economy and had businesses there. And that area also needs to have further research.
Tell me what you found out about the churches. What a fascinating story that is.
The issue of the churches is that, at least from my perspective, the 12 northern counties of Kentucky at least had 2 different African American churches. And as early as the 1850s and 1860s, those churches were created. And you can still see the legacy of those churches in all of those different counties. And what's fascinating to me is there's not been a lot of research on it. There's been a couple articles here and there. There's no general book that has a thematic approach that investigates these churches. There's no articles that talks about their legacy, what they're doing today, any of that stuff. I had no idea until I was digging into my pictorial history on African Americans in northern Kentucky and stumbled across all these churches.
And is there a difference? Now, there were some very, very important, almost centers of the community type churches in Covington and Newport, and they were the AME type churches. But were those the same types of churches that could be found out in the rural areas?
Yes,
they were.
Exactly. They're kind of connected because folks would leave their home church and they want to start another church in another local community. So they would have pastors or ministers just leaving to start other churches, and so they have direct ties with the pastorship of that earlier church.
Of course, the real interesting story is the role that ministers played, some of them in kind of a pre-abolitionist role in the history of Kentucky and its constitutions, and some of the facts that some of the churches had African American members.
Yes.
And then, of course, they legislate against them in the 1849 Constitution. Ministers can't hold office. There's that, and that legacy still carries over. It's quite an interesting thing.
Oh, yes, it is. It's fascinating. The issue for me is to try to dig into that story and see what resistance modes that African American ministers took despite of the legal structure, how they continue to empower themselves and their community despite of the legal boundaries that were set up to keep them in certain places.
And I keep running in, of course, obviously, in Kentucky, the experience of John Fee and Berea College, and, of course, the evolution of Berea College from actually, it was established with religious underpinnings and great direction toward African Americans, and then later had to kind of migrate in the post-Civil War era into being an Appalachian type service unit rather than for the black community or the African American community itself.
No question.
Excuse me, go ahead.
But one of the interesting things about Berea College is one of the first colleges to integrate their student body and their faculty and welcome African Americans into higher education. I mean, that's a fascinating story.
Right, and here it is in the Upper South, and what was really, central Kentucky. If there were 2 areas of Kentucky that were said to be somewhat pro-Confederate, central Kentucky, and especially the upper landed gentry, and then also western Kentucky, and yet you see there south of Lexington, Kentucky, that experiment that known as Berea, and of course then Augusta College up on the river, but that shouldn't be so unusual because the river counties tended to be pro-union.
Right.
Across. Tell me about the books you've gotten involved in. 2 books, Eric.
One book has to do with African American leaders in the peace movement, where I put together some documents and some speeches of African Americans such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. King, Coretta Scott King, and they're well-known African Americans and some little-known African Americans of how they defined peace during a time of war from a perspective of African Americans. Not that they were anti-war movement per se, but they had a different understanding of what peace and justice and freedom meant to them. And so they wrote speeches and gave lectures and wrote documents explaining their understanding of peace during a time of war. The other book is on African Americans and in Northern Kentucky, a pictorial history that came out of this whole series by this huge publishing company called Arcadia that's done hundreds of these local histories. So mine took into consideration 3 northern counties of Boone, Kenton, and Campbell County to analyze and put together a pictorial perception of African American life in those 3 counties.
And how did you go about doing that, Eric?
One of the first things I did was to link myself to this local group of African American volunteers and researchers in this group called the Northern Kentucky African American Heritage Task Force. I think they were created in 94, 95.
Very dynamic group.
No question, and they've been involved in preserving and articulating the African American experience for years before I got involved. So I researched that group, became a member of it, interviewed them, went to their homes. The fascinating issue is most of the folks involved in that group opened their doors and had hundreds of photographs that was just there, just sitting there in boxes. Some in good condition, some in harsh conditions, but it's a history just unfolding in front of you, and just sitting there talking to folks who could trace their history back in Kentucky to the 1920s and the 1910s, and nobody has talked to them before.
Yeah, that's primal research in every sense of the word.
No question.
We only have time for one more question here, Egg, but what's been the most satisfying thing you've done here at the university?
Oh, wow.
Just one.
The most satisfying is the different types of colleagues that I've run into and calling folks friends from different backgrounds. I mean, as I talked about earlier, Dr. Wilcox, who's from Canada and has family in Paraguay, and having friends and colleagues who have the same interests that I have on understanding how history influences what folks are doing today.
Well, that's what makes history, and that's what makes the interaction of a university so exciting. And you and I have been close colleagues for a long time, and I appreciate you having an opportunity here to come on the program and discuss some of these things with us. I wish we had some more time, but unfortunately we're out of time now, Eric. That's our program for today. The program, of course, is Northern Lights, and we're glad that you could be with us. Be sure to join us next time for another edition of Northern Lights. And remember, Northern Kentucky University is your university.